Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Today I'd like to speak about Vipassana meditation. First point I would like to clarify is that Vipassana really should be taken to refer to a state of mind rather than to a specific meditation technique. There are several Vipassana methods for accessing this state of mind. They pretty well all come from Burma. This has been a strong tradition in Burma for several hundred years, the Vipassana movement. As far as we can tell, it goes back, it doesn't go that far back in time as an organized system of meditations. The Vipassana movement in Burma really began in the 18th century. There's a historical link between the beginnings of the Vipassana movement and British colonialism, because when previously under the kingdom, the Burmese kingdom, the Sangha was under very tight hierarchical control, and they kept the monks under very strict supervision from the center. And there was a discouragement of experimentation with new techniques, new methods of meditation. But when the British occupied part of Burma, the monks living in that part of Burma were no longer under the effective control of the Sangha hierarchy, and the British really didn't care what they did, so they were more free to experiment. And the Vipassana traditions that we know of today all began in the late 18th, early 19th century. There are several, actually quite a few, traditions of Vipassana meditation that came out of Burma. The ones that come outside of Burma into other countries are fewer in number. There's the Mahāsi tradition, Goenka tradition, Pa'ak tradition. These are all Vipassana methods that came out of Burma and became established in other countries, including Western countries, and also in other Theravada countries like Sri Lanka and Thailand. They've made some impact. The particular method that I was trained in, this is actually how I started meditating, I guess it's getting close to 40 years ago now, was the Mahāsi Method. It's named after the monk Mahāsi Sayādaw, who lived in the first half of the 20th century. And so that's what I'll be focusing on in this talk, because it's the only method I really feel competent to talk on in any detail. As I said, we should think of Vipassana as a state of mind. It means something like clear seeing, and it means that the mind is observing the objects of consciousness clearly in a dispassionate way, without attachment, without judgment or discrimination, without picking and choosing, just simply being aware of what presents itself to consciousness at each moment. And if this state of mind is found and is persevered in, then naturally the objects of consciousness become clear to the mind and reveal themselves to be imbued with the three characteristics of emptiness, suffering, and impermanence. The three universal characteristics, the tilakkhana. Normally, we don't see things in this way because our minds are caught up with picking and choosing, with liking and disliking, with being afraid or being fascinated. And we get caught up in the objects and we identify with the objects. But practicing Vipassana, we're trying to step back and just clearly see without coloring it by any kind of preferences or self-view, just seeing what is the object of consciousness at this moment. Now, there are many difficulties or obstacles to really accessing this state of mind, and one of them is the kind of fuzziness of consciousness. Some people try to practice what's sometimes called choiceless awareness, of just being aware of the contents of consciousness without any particular formal method. And the problem with this is that it lacks specificity. The objects are not seen crisply and clearly in their own nature. We're trying to see things as they are with a very precise focus. What is this object now? There is a mental state that's essential for doing this. It's a particular form of equanimity called Tatra Majjhatthata, and it's been translated as specific neutrality. A literal breakdown of the word would give us being in the middle about that. Tatra is that, and it's an emphatic that. It's like this specific thing. And Majjhata means being in the middle. So not being swayed from one side to the other, to liking or disliking, from fear or fascination. Just being very clear and precise. What is this object, this particular object here right now? And I think this quality is the particular strength of the Mahāsi Method, which emphasizes that particularity, that precision of noting that I think is can be missing from a more informal approach. So I'll speak now about the particular method that's known as the Mahāsi Method. Sometimes you'll hear it called the noting method. The meditator should, in the sitting posture, should begin the session by observing the movement of the abdomen as we breathe, the rising and falling of the belly as we breathe. And this is taken as a broad object. It's not a point, it's the entire bowl of the abdomen is noticed rising and falling. And this is so we don't get too much concentration. We have a broad brush, So we watch that, being aware of that physical process for anywhere from a few breaths to a few minutes until the mind feels settled and centered. And then you make a subtle shift in the mind and be aware of whatever arises to consciousness, whether it's an internal object like a thought or a memory or a daydream, or whether it's an external object like a sound, a smell, or a sensation elsewhere in the body. And the special practice of the Mahāsi Method is to make a mental note of the object. Now, this is done very lightly and subliminally and quickly. You just put a label or a note on the object as, for example, remembering or hearing or feeling pain, feeling cold, feeling hot, just like that. Now, a few things about this this technique of noting. First of all, don't get caught up with it. Don't waste any time trying to decide what is the correct note. The noting is really secondary. The important thing is that you have seen the object clearly. The noting is just a way of making sure you have done that and you're being specific. So it's kind of a little trick you're playing on yourself. You just make sure you've seen that object. If you've seen it clearly, you're able to put a label on it. So there's no really such thing as correct or incorrect labeling, but there are some guidelines that make it more helpful. The label should be very short, 1 or 2 words, and try to use verbs rather than nouns so that it's hearing rather than sound. Thinking rather than thought. And I would also suggest you try with the mental objects, you try and distinguish clearly between thoughts of past and future. So remembering or speculating or worrying rather than just lump everything together as thinking. And it's particularly important, very useful if you notice intentions, any intention that arises in the mind. To begin with, coarse intentions of movement of the body. Like if you feel you need to shift your posture, you should never just shift your leg or your arm, but you should first notice discomfort, then you notice intention to move, and then you notice moving. So the intention is very important. There are some more subtle physical intentions. There's the intention to swallow. Periodically, our mouths fill with saliva and we swallow. And you should notice that discomfort and then notice the intention to swallow before you swallow. There's an even more subtle physical intention that if you have your eyes open, for example, when you're walking, if you notice the intention to blink, now you're getting to a very subtle, very refined level of noticing if you notice the intention to blink before you blink. But there's even a subtler intention than that. There is intention connected with thought. And you can notice the intention to think before you think. You can feel the mind kind of moving towards a thought which does not at this point have any content, but you can feel the mind sort of coming together, gathering for a thought. And if you notice that intention clearly at that point, the thought will be terminated. It won't complete itself. So the mind can become very, very quiet. You can experience an extremely quiet mind with occasional intention to think. In the normal course of things, you'll find yourself naturally cycling between a state where the mind seems very busy and you're doing quite a lot of noticing, and a state where the mind is very, very quiet. There doesn't seem to be anything to notice. And then at that point, you should avoid trying to search around or fabricate things to notice. You just go back to noticing the bodily sensation of breathing until the mind becomes busy again. And you'll cycle in and out of those two states. So the breath at your belly is kind of your home base. It's not a object you focus on it exclusively like in samadhi meditation, but it's a place you rest. You go back there when the mind is quiet and stay there until there's something to notice. There's a good rule of thumb or principle to remember at all times when you're doing this practice is whatever arises in the mind should be treated the same. So the way it can be phrased is, nothing is so trivial that it can be ignored, and nothing is so important that it needs to be held on to. This is really the challenge, because some content that arises to the mind might have some emotional resonance and we get caught in it. Some memory that seems meaningful to us, or some concern about the future, we get caught in that. We should try to notice everything with that same level of intention, and try and notice things very specifically, so you break things up. If there's, if taking this example, say an old memory comes up that has some strong emotional attachment for you, the content of the memory is one thing, the emotional reaction is another, any sensation in the body is another, and so on. Don't just lump it all together. Notice specific components. In walking meditation, the same practice is carried on, but here, instead of using the breath as the home object, we use the sensation on the soles of the feet as we walk very slowly backwards and forwards. Can also do this, carry this on in various activities, like making yourself a cup of tea or sweeping the floor. You try and be aware of the motions of the body and any thoughts or feelings that arise. So this can be carried on in activity as well, although the most intensive form is when you're sitting or walking. There is a whole literature on the stages that the meditator goes through in pursuing this practice. This has its origins in a sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya, the Relay Coach Sutta, where various states of mind are described like a relay coach. A relay coach is a way of a fast movement in ancient times. They would have, for like royal messengers, they would have stations set up every so many miles, and you would be able to drive your horse very fast, and then you get to the station, you change horses. So these stages are compared to posts on the relay road. But this sutta is quite, as many times we find in the Sutta Pitaka, the sutta is very concise, and there's no real description of these stages. Visuddhimagga, which is a meditation manual written by Buddhaghosa about 1,000 years after the Buddha, and is a very important formative text in the Theravada tradition. The whole text of the Visuddhimagga, which runs to some 900 pages, is framed around this Relay Coach Sutta, going through these various stages. And a very good modern treatment of these stages is found in the writings of Mahāsi Sayādaw, particularly his book, The Progress of Insight, which details the stages the mind goes through. I won't go through this whole subject in great detail, but I'll kind of touch on some of the highlights here. After the mind has gained some clarity and insight, it's then possible that various experiences will occur, and these are mostly at this stage, are mostly of a kind of pleasant nature, like seeing, the ones that are listed are like seeing bright light, or feeling thrills in the body, feeling an outpouring of faith. And these are all sort of jhanic type experiences, and in the insight path, they're called the 10 corruptions of insight. This is the first signpost where many meditators at this point believe they've attained to enlightenment. This is a common mistake if they don't have proper learning or guidance, because it feels very powerful. And the advice is not to get too interested or attached to any of these phenomena, but just notice them clearly. One of my teachers said it doesn't matter whether it's an airplane crashing in the yard or an itchy bum or visions of the Brahma gods in their palaces. It's just an object. Just notice the object and carry on. So if one can practice in this way and just clearly notice the object as it arises, you pass through this stage, and the next stage is called knowledge of what is path and what is not path. And it's said that the real meditation only begins at that point. And then all these phenomena fade away. And again, if the meditator doesn't really understand the process, they can think their meditation's lost, it's not going right, but it actually is progression. They've gone through those 10 corruptions, and their mind is now operating on a different level. And as this goes on, the next and there are several kind of intermediate subtleties, but the mind eventually comes to seeing clearly the nature of samsara, seeing impermanence and suffering and the emptiness of things. And this can be daunting. It can be challenging for the meditator, because it's like taking off your rose-colored glasses and you're looking at reality naked in its own nature as it actually is for the first time. And you realize there's nothing to depend on. Everything is impermanent. Everything's falling away. And this can lead to fear. This can lead to sadness. It can be a difficult passage. But if the meditator has courage and determination and just carries on through, you eventually come out the other side of that and reach the stage that's called equanimity about formations. So this is now a state of mind that's very solidly based on equanimity. You've seen through the nature of samsara, but you haven't yet seen what's beyond, but you're at peace. And this stage is in itself a great blessing. You feel completely at ease. There's no difficulty or sense of striving or effort. But the meditation is flawless. Everything that arises is clearly seen without making any particular effort to do so. So you're not even really, strictly speaking, meditating at that point, because you're not doing anything. You're just sitting there. You're just being, but everything is crystal clear. So this is not yet awakening, but we could say it's the launching pad. This is the only place from which enlightenment can happen, but there's nothing you can do to make it happen. Visuddhimagga has what I think is a very beautiful simile for this state. It talks about mariners at sea in ancient times. They would carry a bird in a cage on the ship, the land-finding crow. And when they thought they might be close to land, they would release the bird and watch which way it flew it would fly off to the north, say, and then they'd wait, and if the bird came back, it meant it didn't find any land. Then it would rest for a while, then it would fly off again to the east. And then if it came back, they knew there's no land in that direction. And eventually the bird didn't come back, and they'd know that they were close to shore in that direction. And Buddhaghosa says the mind is like that in the equanimity about formations. It goes out seeking the far shore, and often it doesn't find it, it just comes back. But eventually, in the words of Buddhaghosa, the mind does that which it has not done since beginningless time, and alights upon non-occurrence. So it arrives at the unconditioned. Samsara is in essence is something that we do. It's not a place or a state. It's a choice. It's something we're doing moment by moment. And when the mind just stops doing that, then we realize nibbana. Getting back to the equanimity about formations, Mahāsi Sayādaw says that the meditator will only be able to remain in that state for maybe a few hours, maybe 4 hours or so. And then if enlightenment is not attained, the mind will fall back to a stage called reobservation. And at that stage, there's a feeling of restlessness. So you know you've lost equanimity. You start to feel restless. And the way to get back is to make a real effort to be still, and to kind of push through that restlessness, and you can get back to equanimity. So you'll go in and out of that until nibbana is realized. And Mahāsi's basing that on experience of teaching thousands of people, observing their mental states. And I would say from my much more limited experience that this is so, that people only seem to be able to hold this state for a few hours, and you go in and out of it. So this is a brief summary of how the stages of insight work. The source to read, if you want a more detailed account, is Mahāsi Sayādaw, Progressive Insight. And this Vipassana practice in general, and Mahāsi Sayadaw tradition is one of them, is meant to develop this clear seeing so that you can see through the nature of samsara and end up reaching disenchantment, dispassion, and liberation by overcoming the tendency of the mind to fall into either fear or fascination. We can see things clearly, and the phenomena become less engaging to the mind. It's like you're playing this game in samsara of the mind wanting to take an object to satisfy or complete itself. It takes the object, and then the object disappoints because it's impermanent, suffering, and empty. But then the mind immediately, the hunger re-arises, and the mind seeks out for the next object. And when we're doing Vipassana meditation, we're still following that same practice. We're still chasing after objects, but we're trying to make it more conscious. And we're trying to see and understand the nature of the process. And when the process is seen clearly, then the energy goes out of samsara. This is the disenchantment and dispassion. It takes the energy of the mind jumping for an object. It takes that away. It diminishes it. And then eventually the mind will just stop doing that. And it does it kind of metaphorically, it does a sort of leap sideways, and it alights upon the unconditioned. So this is the the practice that leads to realization of nibbana. It's a difficult practice, and it's recommended strongly that you have a solid base in samadhi before you undertake that practice, because that'll make it smoother and easier. If the mind is completely untrained and you try and observe the phenomena, it's very difficult, and it can be quite disorienting. I've seen it before more than once, that someone who's a complete beginner tries to undertake serious practice and do Vipassana, and after 3 or 4 days they come and tell me, Ajahn, I think I'm going crazy. I think I'm losing my mind. And I ask them, what's happening? And they say, well, my thoughts are just all over the place. My mind is just a complete jumble. I try and calm them down, and I say, that's, your mind has been like that forever. It's just now you're just noticing it for the first time. One woman had a really good image that I think describes this kind of untrained mind. She said, it's like I'm sitting in my kuti and there's 4 or 5 radios, and they're all fading in and out from different stations, and some of them are static and some of them are music and some of them are talk, and they're fading in and out and all going all at once. If you just persist, you just clearly notice the objects, the mind does become very quiet, and you can notice things on a much more refined and precise level. Sometimes if the mind doesn't fall into that very confused state, all you can do is just keep noticing confusion. And at least that little moment of clarity, just kind of cutting through that, can begin to diminish it. So, before I finish, I'll just say something about the traditional way of practice in the Mahāsi Method in Burma was very strict. Meditators would do a session of maybe 2 weeks or up to 3 months, and the practice was to do formal meditation 20 hours a day, sleep for 4, and there's practice set out for eating. So it's not a break when the mealtime comes. You have a practice of how you eat, which is you notice you eat very slowly, and you notice lifting the spoon, tasting, swallowing, and so on. So you don't break your practice for that. And Mahāsi's idea was that you want to develop a continuity. You want to have an unbroken mindfulness. And he said it's like trying to make a fire by rubbing 2 sticks together. If you stop rubbing the sticks every time you get a bit tired, you'll never get a spark. So, and as I said at the outset, there are other methods of doing Vipassana. I think they're all really skillful means of trying to access the state of mind of clear seeing. And that's what we're really trying to go for, is to have this clear, specific noticing of discrete objects, one after the other, and to see the 3 characteristics in each object, so that then there's a diminishment in the mind of grasping and clinging and desire, and disenchantment and dispassion can arise.